About 6 weeks ago, I recorded a video and posted it up on YouTube. It was called COVID Statistics. And I questioned how the numbers that were being reported were being used. And one of the many aspects of statistics that I talked about in that video was how that early in the pandemic, when the mortality rates were in double digits, approaching 16%, they were reported where I lived in Florida all the time. Every day I would pull up the statistics from the state and mortality rate would be 15, 14, 13. And of course at the time they were locking us down and doing all these other things. But early on, the testing was being done of people who were coming into the hospital sick and of the people in the hospitals, the nurses and the doctors, to see if they had it. So you had a lot of people testing positive, proportionally to how many people were being tested. And I speculated that as we tested more, the mortality rates would drop because they were already dropping. What had prompted the video was that suddenly the state statistics I was seeing didn't cover mortality rates anymore. Once it had hit 8%, they stopped reporting it. And looking around and looking at some numbers, I found it had indeed gone under 8%. And yet at the same time, in the county I lived in, they were hitting us with a curfew. So even though the mortality rate had gone, been cut in half, they were actually laying on new controls on us. And I thought that this was strange that they would be doing these two things simultaneously. It was almost as if they didn't want to admit that the mortality rate was dropping because they were putting more restrictions on us. So what I decided to do was look at the numbers again, primarily here in Florida where I live, but also at the national numbers, and just to see, what's going on. Because if you watch the media, it's the end of the world. There's this huge, number of cases coming in, which is true. Now, not all of that's because of increased testing, but I think a lot of it is. And the real question is, what about the death rates? What about the mortality rates? And these, again, aren't being reported. Now, at the height, back at one point in May, before they started unlocking us down in Florida, we were losing about 60, 62, 63 people a day would die. And then as they reopened the state, that number actually started to come down. Now, as this new surge hit, it did go back up. At one point, it hit 40. But then once it hit 40, about 2.5 weeks ago, it started coming down again. And the last few days, it's been in single digits. And of course, as the mortality rate keeps dropping, or I should say as the number of deaths keep dropping, and the number of cases is exploding, what you end up with is a lower mortality rate. So what I wanted to see, because I don't see the reports on this, is to get into the numbers that are readily available and do the calculations myself. And I thought that's what I talked about in this video. What did I find? Well, what I found was, I think, pretty interesting. And the first thing I looked at was the stats for the entire United States. And you look at the number of people who have been infected, the number of cases reported, and the number of people have died. What's the mortality rate down to? Because I assumed it was going down. And indeed it has. Nationally, the mortality rate is down to 4.4%, based on the numbers that I can find today. 4.4%. Now keep in mind, 6 weeks ago, it was about 8%. It's a little under 8%. And before that, it was as high as, it was double digits, like 13, 14, 15%. I think the highest I ever saw was 16%. So that's gone down a lot in the last 6 weeks. It's gone from about 8% to, roughly 4.5%. Then I thought, most of the deaths disproportionately are in New York, and the cases as well. So I thought, let's look at the 50 states minus New York. Let's just look at 49 states. And if you take New York out of the equation, and you look at the rest of the country, Hawaii, Alaska, everything else, the mortality rate is down to 3.8%. Then I decided, let me go and just look at Florida. Now Florida, when I posted my COVID YouTube video the last time, was just under 8%. What's it now in Florida? Pause. resume. And to my surprise, despite all the new cases, despite the Democrats calling for shutting down the state again, we need to lock down again, we need to do all these things, 6 weeks after it was just under 8%, the mortality rate in Florida is now 1.8%. It's under 2%. And keep in mind, last year we hit with the flu was about 1%. So we're getting close to where we were last year with the flu. And of course, there was no lockdown, there was no news coverage. Now, my conclusion is that they're playing around with the numbers again. They're not showing you the mortality rates because they don't want you to think that they don't need to do the things that they want to do. I mean, if they came out and they told the people, well, you know, when we started the lockdown, the mortality rate was in double digits. It's now under 2% in Florida. But we're going to lock you down again. We're going to make you wear masks when you're outside. We're going to close all the businesses again. Now, the last time they did it, like I said, at one point it was in double digits. Now it's down under 2%. Nationally, it's under 4% without New York. And with New York, it's roughly 4.5%, 4.4%. So things are getting better. But that's not what's being reported. What's being reported is the surge of cases. But the odd thing is, you know, if you look at the numbers, the more cases there are, if you have these huge increases in cases, if you don't also have a huge increase in deaths, the mortality rate drops. And it's not inconceivable at the rate it's going that if I do this video in another 6 weeks, it's possible we're going to be in the range where this isn't a pandemic. Now, I don't know at what point the CDC says it's no longer a pandemic because, you know, we don't call it pandemic when there was a flu last year, when about 1% of the mortality rate was about 1%. That wasn't a pandemic. It wasn't even covered in the news for the most part. But now in Florida, we're down under 2% from about 8% 6 weeks ago. So, you know, you do the math, we're going down, the mortality rate's dropping about 1% a month. Now, there's no guarantee it's going to continue to do that. But if they keep testing at the rates that they're testing, and you still see, you know, death rates in Florida at 6, 7 single digits, it's going to happen. And at that point, people are going to ask really big questions like, what the hell have we been doing? Was this all worth it? Because before you could say, well, we didn't have these increases because we were locked down, but we're not locked down now. And yes, there's an increase in cases, but you're not seeing an increase in deaths. And, you know, these are just some of the questions that I have and I don't see being asked, certainly not being reported in the media. You know, you'll hear it here and there, or if you go to YouTube, you may find somebody talking about it. Some doctor, I read the story somewhere, I forget what university, he taught out, he lost his job for coming out and pointing out that the mortality rate keeps dropping. I heard somebody today saying that under CDC guidelines, pretty soon it's not going to be even rated as a pandemic anymore, despite the huge number of cases. So there are going to be questions to be asked when this is over, because we don't know how low that mortality rate's going. It's already, as I posted in a video, you know, I'll link to this video too, along with the earlier one I did on COVID below. Mortality rate when I was a kid of getting polio was like 2.5%. We're under that in Florida. And they didn't lock us down in the summers when I was a kid. It was 2.5%. And now it's, what, 1.8% here in Florida? So, yeah, I don't have all the answers, but I have some questions. And of course, the American media doesn't like asking questions. They have their narrative, and they're going to stick to it. You may recall, and keep this in mind, that when they told us they were locking us down the first time, it wasn't to save lives. It wasn't so much to prevent cases as it was to preserve the health system. They said we had to flatten the curve. Remember that? Flatten the curve. I put the image up there. But if you look closely at the curve, you'll notice that when you flatten the curve, when you bring the top of the curve below the line of what the hospital system can handle, you're not really eliminating the number of cases that are going to occur. You're basically pushing them chronologically down the road. You squeeze the curve, which is peaked, so it doesn't spread out evenly because it can't go backwards. So basically it goes this way and moves down along the line. If you look at the curve closely, you don't really get fewer cases. What you get is you actually extend, you delay, you attenuate the pandemic by spreading it out along the timeline. I would argue that's what's happening today. It's exactly what they predicted with the diagrams that they showed us. We will flatten the curve. We will prevent the health system from being overwhelmed. But down the road, all the cases that would have occurred had we not done these things are still going to occur. In other words, if you look at the diagram, locking down isn't going to prevent cases. It's not going to prevent lives from being lost in the long run. It prevents them from all happening at one time. But again, you just push it down the chronological line. So they're going to occur later. And what I would argue is what's happening today is exactly what they were telling us with their diagrams, if not with their words. I mean, it's exactly what one should expect, looking at what they were telling us at the time. And now, of course, they've changed their tune, as they always do. The science in their diagrams, which was, unquestionable, beyond questioning 2 months ago, now they want to forget. Because they told us this was going to happen with those diagrams. It's just people have forgotten. Anyway, if you like the video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification button so you'll know when I post new videos. And until the next time, I am out of here.